The Powers Project.
Lee, it's great to have you today. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Kurt. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. Um, when I found out about you and I found out about your book called "No Way They Were Gay," I was like, "Wow, exactly." I said, "Oh, I want to read this because while I've heard about historical people, throughout history being gay, it was always like, well, was there any real proof of that they were gay, or is it just assumed they were gay? You break it down and show, the fact that these people were indeed gay and prove that fact. One of the things I loved about your book is um, how you wrote it. Like, it's very informative, and in fact, I'm going to talk about the Eleanor Roosevelt part here in a little bit, but it was just such easy reading and so enjoyable. And you don't, when it comes to history, books that deal with history aren't always very enjoyable or easy reads. They tend to be very matter of fact, and this book isn't like that at all. It's an extremely enjoyable read. So I'm
Thanks.
glad I
I,
had a chance
I,
to read it.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, when I was in school, history was taught like medicine. It was like, here's a list of names and dates to memorize.
Exactly.
Uh, and I really hated history. So the fact that I've grown up to be an adult that wrote a history book cracks me up. Uh, like, who would have thought that? Like, I felt so disconnected from it. I'm gay and I didn't come out until, I mean, fully until I was 25. So from age 11 to 25, I was like actively hiding being gay all the time. And I'd never felt a reflection of myself. There was nobody there was no guy that liked another guy in history as far as I was taught. So as an adult, to discover that there actually were like men who loved men besides me,
Right.
like there was Abraham Lincoln and there was Gandhi and like there was all these incredible people in history. Um, that was super exciting. And then I thought, all right, well, okay, if I'm going to write a book of history, how do I not make it medicine? How do I actually make it fun and like chocolate? Like, what's the history version of chocolate that's empowering? And so that's what I really went for. So like, I don't know if your listeners know like the VH1 pop-up videos where they would take like these old videos and they would pop up facts that were super interesting about like Madonna or whatever. And I tried to do that. So like instead of like really old-fashioned medicine-y footnotes, there are all these pop-up commentaries on the page, like bubbles, next to interesting facts with like squiggly arrows to it and interpretations. And then I also really feel like we've had hundreds and hundreds of years of historians that are sort of filtering and sort of sanitizing history for the protection of the people in power and trying to give people publishers what they want and kind of hiding a lot of these stories. And so I thought it was really important to center the voices of the people in the past as best as I could. So one of the things my publisher agreed to was to make all the primary sources bold. So if you're just flipping through the book, it's really obvious, like, what did Shakespeare actually say? Like, what is the language in Shakespeare's sonnets, and what is me talking about what Shakespeare said and what it might mean? Like, I never wanted people to be confused reading it and be like, is this Lee saying this, or is this Sappho saying this? Not that I talk like Sappho, but I mean, I just thought that that was super important. So I love that aspect of the book, that it's like, you really can just flip through it and be like, okay, I'm going to learn about Weiwa, who is someone I had never even heard of before doing the research for the book.
Yeah, and I hadn't either. In fact, there's another one too. Mempo.
Mempo Nathunya.
Yeah, I'd never heard of her either. So it was. I mean, I'm glad I got to learn about her, but in these characters I wasn't aware of. And that's the thing about your book, is like, you don't even have to read the whole book in one sitting. You can actually pick the character out, want the character that you want to learn about. And I loved like those little bubbles that you were talking about. I just, like, I was always happy to see a bubble, some of those bubbles on the page. So, because they were very informative, and yet, they were, like you said, it's like chocolate. You wanted to read it, so I
Well, and also sometimes questions came up, and I was like, something about like Queen Anne and this really crazy relationship that she had with Sarah Churchill, and how they were like, she was being blackmailed, and like, and then there was like the money amount, like how much the blackmail was. And I was like, well, I wonder what that, like all the questions, I'm a super curious person. So all the questions that I had as I was doing the research, I was like, oh, I should tell people how much money that is in today's money,
right.
because that would be really interesting. Because I mean, to hear that it was 20,000 pounds in, 16, whatever, like who,
Right.
what the hell does that mean? But, to know that, oh, it was $2.4 million, like, oh, okay, that's different. That's a different kind of blackmail.
Yeah, it is definitely. So, I will say this: there were two notables that were left out of the book, and
Oh,
one
there were
of
so
them,
many people left out.
yeah. And so that's what I was going to ask you. Well, let me make the notable ones that were left out. One was the Sacred Band of Thieves.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you could probably do a whole book just on them.
I
Honestly,
had a chapter on Alexander the Great and the
that
Sacred Band
was
of Thebes.
yes, and Alexander the Great was the second one. I was going to say that was the second notable one that was left out. Was
Yeah.
there a reason, or is it just because it would have been more?
There was a reason. So originally the manuscript was 15 chapters, 15 really in-depth chapters, and then like a dozen other short profiles. And in the process of working on the book with my editor, and really we aimed the book for readers age 11 and up. So we were trying that there was a limit to how many pages the book could be. Also, in terms of medicine versus chocolate, like I didn't want like a 400-page book. Like
Right.
that's not going
Yeah.
to feel like chocolate.
Yeah.
So there was a page limit, and I was faced with a choice. I was told I either have to cut everything dramatically, or I could eliminate 3 chapters. So it went from 15 in-depth chapters to 12 in-depth chapters, because I think there felt like a point. There are a lot of survey books. Like I love those survey books where it's like 1 or 2 pages on all these different people in history that might have been queer. I think they're really, really fascinating, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't want to do just a surface skim level thing where it's like you get 1 or 2 lines from a Shakespeare sonnet and you hear like, oh, well, some people thought Shakespeare was a guy who loved another guy. I really wanted to go into it, and I wanted to have at least 4 sonnets that we could analyze and look at together. And really, I mean, I feel like because of what I'm doing, everybody, like, there's a sense that like I'm trying to convince the world that I'm right and they're wrong about history. And I'm really not. I can't control anybody but myself, but I do feel a little bit like a lighthouse. Like I'm trying to shine a light on
Right.
this incredibly cool stuff that I came upon, and then let people make their own decisions. I mean, yeah, they're going to make their own decisions anyway. So as soon as I let go of trying to like convince anybody, I'm just like, whoa, my mind was blown so many times in doing the research for this book. And I'm like, okay, here's what I know. And then when I came upon stuff that was contradictory, I brought that up. I didn't hide it. I didn't try to like build my case by excluding stuff that didn't go. Like for instance, in the Sappho chapter, there was one poem that Sappho wrote that was about her pining for a young man. I
Mhm.
didn't not include it. I included it, but I also included the context that like the vast majority of her poems were about her love for other women. And just because she has a poem talking about being romantically attracted to a young man doesn't mean that she wasn't also attracted to women. It's not like, haha, she was straight. No, no, no. Like people were
Right.
complicated in history, and we can all handle that people were complicated. And I really like that, because I feel like so much of history has been manipulated in the telling, and I didn't want to be a manipulator of history. I just want to be like a spotlight shiner of history.
And I think that was very important. When I read your book, that's what I felt like, is that you, because you didn't leave anything out. You did say, oh yes, like Sappho did have, did write a poem about a young male lover. Um, but I think that the fact that you didn't leave it out, it adds validity to your work, that you weren't trying to manipulate it, because that's one of the things, like you just spoke about a little while ago, is that there are some historians out there who tried to hide this, as if you mentioned that Abraham Lincoln was gay, that somehow diminishes the man and what he did, and And I go, how? How do you if Abraham Lincoln was gay and everybody knew it, how does that diminish who he was and what he did? How? And it doesn't make any sense. So it was great to have you kind of like be that lighthouse, like you said, that beacon to shine the light on there to go, hey, this is the truth of the matter. You can take from it what you want, but I just want to show you this. And so I really appreciated that throughout the book.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln was really the first for me. It was the first person I learned about in history that was really significant, that there was really amazingly abundant evidence that he was in love with another man. And uh, as I said, I didn't come out until I was 25. And then in my 20s, I felt like I had to spend a little bit of time being a teenager again, kind of making up for all the time that I wasn't authentic. And so I went to a talk at one point where a, a gay man was talking about Abraham Lincoln and the letters he wrote to Joshua Fry Speed that convinced him that Abraham was in love with Joshua. And I was like, how is that possible? Like, how could I be, a grown adult in the United States and have studied, have taken history classes and never even heard of anything about this? But I went to the library and I got out a book, a book called Joshua Fry Speed, Abraham Lincoln's Most Intimate Friend. And there was an appendix. I hated history, remember, like medicine. So I just basically skipped the entire front and I went right to the appendix. And I'm like, I want to read the letters. And it had all the letters in order. And I, again, wasn't going to start from the beginning. I found history really boring. So I just kind of like randomly threw the page open to a page and I started reading. And it was a letter that Abraham had written 8 months after this guy that people believe that he was in love with, that I believe he was in love with, Joshua Fry Speed. So Abraham and Joshua had lived together for 4 years in Springfield, and in fact shared a bed for that time. There are a lot of historians that say that that was really typical on the frontier. I think you could have a discussion about whether Springfield was the frontier at that time, but
Right.
I don't think that's either here nor there. I think that what's less interesting to me is what they did physically and more about their emotional. Like, I don't want to play CSI history. I don't want to like go back and try to like, be a detective and find out like, did these two do, have intimate time together? I think that's really not interesting or unprovable. But were they in love with each other? Yeah, I think we can look at primary sources, we can look at the letters, and I think that there's a lot of evidence for people being in love with each other. And frankly, when we think about language and words, we use the expression homosexual in our culture, and I think that that doesn't do any good for the gay community. I think that because it makes people focus on how we have sex and think that that's what distinguishes a person if they're queer. And I think that if we thought about love, and the term was homo-lovual, if we were talking about homo-lovual rights and homo-lovual history, we'd be having very different conversations. So with a homo-lovual lens, looking at Abraham and Joshua, they lived together for 4 years. Joshua goes back to Kentucky and marries this woman named Fanny. And Abraham sends him this letter 8 months later and says, and this is the page I just flipped open to randomly. It said, "Are you now in feeling as well as judgment glad that you're married as you are? From anybody but me, this would be an impudent question not to be tolerated, but I know you'll tolerate it from me. Please tell me quickly. I feel very impatient to know." We don't have the answer, but we do know it was only like 4 weeks later that Abraham married Mary Todd. So I read that and I got goosebumps, because in that period of time where I was closeted and dating girls and hiding being gay and denying being gay to myself, when I was dating girls, I sort of judged it the right thing to do, but I didn't feel it. And I kept wondering, would the feeling come? Like, if I found the right girl, would the feeling come? And it didn't. And I eventually got honest with myself and with everyone else in my life. But reading that that's how Abraham felt, like, and that's how Joshua felt, like, are you now in feeling as well as judgment, glad that you're married as you are? That was this moment that cracked the whole thing open for me. And I was like, oh my gosh. So then I wanted to write 2 books, actually. I started to think, I wanted to write a novel about a kid today that is closeted, and sort of like a time machine novel of myself, and like what an impact that would have made on me if I had discovered that back when I was dating a girl and I was in high school, like how it would have changed my life. So I actually wrote a novel. It's called Queer as a $5 Bill, and it came out in 2018. And but as I was researching that novel, I wanted it to be a page turner about like this kid who thinks that he's going to change the world by outing Abraham Lincoln, and then it just blows up in a huge media firestorm and conservative backlash. Like I wanted to tell that story, but I wanted it to be grounded in reality. So also I did that thing where like everything real that Abraham said in the letters was in bold in the book. And as I was working on it, there was just so much evidence that kept coming up more and more and more that really backed up this idea that Abraham was in love with Joshua. And not just for that 4-year period, but really throughout their lives. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe there's a nonfiction book here. But again, I didn't like history. And I thought, a nonfiction book just about Abraham and Joshua being in love. Like, I don't even think I would have picked that up as a kid. I would have just sort of rolled my eyes and like, yeah, that's so improbable. No, probably not. But then I thought, well, then I just started to collect stories, like more and more stories of more and more men who love men, and then also women who loved women, like Eleanore Roosevelt, and then people who lived outside gender boundaries. And I thought, well, maybe that's a more interesting book. Maybe to talk about this sort of like, we teach history like this false facade that history is the story of rich, white, straight, able-bodied men from Europe that are wealthy. And like, that's the history. And like, my daughter is in college now, but when she was in high school, her history book could have been my history book. It had no stories of people of color or of women or queer people. It was not diverse at all. And I remember being at a back to school night and like raising my hand and asking the teacher kind of pointedly, not obnoxiously, I hope, but respectfully, I was like, so what about the other stories in history? I've looked at the textbook. And she was like, oh yeah, textbook's not very diverse, but we have a lot of supplemental material. And I was thinking about like, what a horrible message that is for kids. That like, here's the important history in the textbook. And then I'm gonna, run through the Xerox machine, a couple of articles about some women in history or some Black people in history or, some Asian people in history, or, maybe we'll even mention that there was a queer person. And I just thought, oh, damn, that's the book I want to write. I want to write a book that takes down that false facade of history. And because once you open it up and you recognize that like history has been sanitized for the protection of the people in power, then suddenly it's all these other stories too. It's not just the queer stories that are the ones I focused on in this book, In No Way They Were Gay. It's all those other stories as well. It's the stories of people of color and women and disabled people and everybody else that hasn't been included. And it's not to say that the straight cis people weren't important, but they weren't the only ones who were important. And when you look back at history, the idea that every single important person in history was straight seems ridiculous, right? Like on the face of it, if we look at statistics, like that just is impossible. So why don't we open our eyes a little bit and be more open to the possibilities? And that's actually the very front of the book. There's a map of the world flipped upside down. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but like it has like the southern continent on top, like the southern hemisphere is like the map is just flipped upside down. And the idea is that it's the same world just looked at with a different lens. And I think that that's the sort of like shift of your mindset. Like, oh yeah, it is kind of improbable that every single important person in history would have only had romantic interest in someone of another gender. And it also is sort of improbable that there are only two genders.
Well, I think you just answered my very first question I had for you, which was why the need for such a book? So
check, we did that.
Check that one out. So, no, and you did. You explained it brilliantly as to why there's such a need, because it's never mentioned, and as if only white European men did. And again, they did a lot, not taking anything away from them, but to give them credit for everything, as people of color, women or gay people didn't have didn't do something great in throughout history as well would be less than honest.
And the reason it's called No Way They Were Gay is because when I was doing the research, I must have said no way like 100 times. Like when I discovered that Michelangelo had carved a secret into the statue of David that the pupils of the eyes are shaped as hearts. I like, I like almost screamed. I was so excited about that.
Okay, so let me ask you, what um, process did you use to choose who to put in the book and who not? Because, like you said, there are a ton of other people out there, like Michelangelo, Low, excuse me, Alan Turing, again, Alexander the Great. There's plenty of other guys. So, and women. So, who, like, how, who made the cut and why did they make the cut?
So I tried to keep an eye on, like, I'm building a story of that this is across time. So I wanted like people from really far times ago, like Hatshepsut, right? A pharaoh, it like 2000 plus years ago in Egypt, and I wanted it to be also more modern, like Christine Jorgensen, who became world famous in the 1950s for having gender affirming surgery and kind of in the public eye transforming from a guy to a girl. But that wasn't really the case. It was a physical transformation, but Christine had always been had always identified as a woman, as a girl, and went on a very difficult journey to try to figure that out, and then became so famous that she basically had to go into show business because she was like in the spotlight so much. So I was trying to do, I didn't want it to be like you could just Google search this. Like it didn't seem like what the book I wanted to tell wasn't like, wow, isn't it amazing how, there are these cool people in the news today that, you can go to their website or you can go to Instagram and follow Alok Menon, who is incredible, this incredible non-binary person and leading this. I think Alok's amazing, but like I didn't want to do a thing about like celebrities today, because there's this thing, especially in the gay community, where everybody's like, oh yeah, gay pride started in 1969 with the Stonewall Rebellion. And I felt like it was really important. Stonewall, absolutely super important moment, especially in the US in terms of like, queer standing up for ourselves, and, shout out to like Sylvia Rivera and, the trans women that were there and the drag queens, and yet that's not where pride began. That's not where our history began. And being able to show that it goes all the way back in time and then all around the world, that it isn't just white people from America, that it is in every country and every continent. I don't know about Antarctica, but probably Antarctica too.
At least
so yeah, there's not that many people there, but I felt like that was, and so really, I actually ended up trying to explain it. I have a section like, how did I choose these people? And it was really surprised, because I thought, well, what's the least boring thing I can do? I can share the people that surprised me the most. So that's really what I did. And even the people that you've never heard about, they're there because they surprised me the most. Like Wewa, as an example, talking as a way to start to talk about this tradition of two-spirit people of a third gender or fourth gender in native cultures in North America. I really wanted to talk about that, because when I started researching it, there were so many, and so many cultures had it, and had like a sort of honored place in their society for third gender people. And I felt like that was super amazing and enlightening, and a total like, no way moment, right? Like, so that was a lot of my process. And Nempo Natlunya is another that I'd never heard of, but it turned out that she was a window into, in Lesotho, a country in Africa, into this sort of tradition of women who loved other women relationships and public celebrations of those relationships, kind of right before homophobia took over and really transformed the culture in Lesotho, to a point where those relationships are now closeted. So that was super fascinating, and that was really recent. In fact, the American woman that helped her publish her autobiography is still alive. And in fact, I was able to correspond with her. So that was really my thought process. Like, how do I make it, like, because I didn't want to be an encyclopedia. Again, I didn't want it to be a 500-page book. But I wanted it to be the beginning of an exploration for the reader. Like, wow, like if I know this, then how much else is there to learn? How many more cool things are there to come upon?
Well, um, you made, I think you made great choices, because again, every one of these stories are interesting. And even like you said, like I was like, Gandhi was gay. That one I absolutely didn't know about.
Okay, wait. Can I please read the love contract between Gandhi and the guy he loves, Herman Kallenbach?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so Gandhi was trained as a lawyer under the British system, and then July 29, 1911, he wrote this love contract between him and this guy Herman Kallenbach, this German Jewish architect that he was in this relationship with, and so they had nicknames for each other in their correspondence. So one of them was upper house and one of them was lower house. So here's the contract. Articles of agreement between lower house and upper house. Lower house is to proceed to Europe on a sacred pilgrimage to the members of his family during the month of August next. Lower house is not to spend any money beyond necessities benefiting the position of a simple living poor farmer. Lower house is not to contract any marriage tie during his absence. Lower house shall not look lustfully upon any woman. Lower house is to travel third class, whether by sea or land. Lower class may, if the exigencies of his business in Johannesburg permit it, visit India with Dr. Mehta. In the event of his doing so, he will travel the same class as Dr. Mehta. Lower house will not tarry long in London or any place save the homes of the members of the family. The consideration for all the above tasks imposed by lower house on himself is more love and yet more love between the two houses, such love as they hope the world has not seen. In witness whereof the parties hereto solemnly affix their signatures in the presence of the maker of all this, 29th day of July at Tolstoy Farm. So that was written by Mohandas Gandhi and signed by Herman Kallenbach.
I have a dear friend of mine who's gay and he's a lawyer. I wonder if he writes his love letters like that.
That's kind of amazing, right? Like
it is very amazing.
more love and yet more love between them. Wow, that was just, I was like, what? No way.
You point out that oftentimes gay people had to write in secret code, and and we were talking about Abraham Lincoln, and one of the things that absolutely convinced me, I mean, besides the other evidence that you presented, was the fact that when he wrote Joshua, he wrote a second letter that Joshua could show his wife so she wouldn't get suspicious from the letter that he actually wrote, which I thought that was really slick. It's like that was
That was
brilliant.
that was pretty tricky. Yeah.
But that was, it takes you to go, this is what people were relegated to. They, gay people, in order to, not be outed, not to be ostracized from society or condemned or whatever it might be, depending on where they live. These are the tactics they had to resort to. And even up into today, there's still people who do that.
Kurt, let me just read. So really, because I love bringing their voices out, like sharing their voices. So
Yes.
I really want to hear, I want to quote Lincoln. So he wrote this letter from Springfield, February 25, 1842 to Joshua. I write another letter enclosing this, which you can show her, Fanny,
Right.
Joshua's wife, if she desires it. I do this because she would think strangely, perhaps, should you tell her that you received no letters from me, or telling her you do, should refuse to let her see them.
Exactly. It's
A secret decoy letter. Like, how cool is that?
like I said, that was just brilliant. It's just like, because he knew she's going to ask to either see it or want to know what it was about, and so just to be on the safe side, he did what he had to do. And you and
There's
I,
a decoy letter you can show her that doesn't say anything about, like, do you actually love her?
right. And you and I talked when we talked on the phone before the show. I said, because to me, it only seems plausible that Mary Todd's depression and mental illness or mental issues that she had might have stemmed from the fact that she knew Abraham was gay. And so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether he was gay or whether he was bi, I mean, I think it seems clear to me from what I've read that the object of his affection romantically was not his wife. And I think it was Joshua. And there are other people in history, other guys in history that other historians have said like, oh, I think that they had a relationship. Again, I don't know that it's important for me to define like, what kind of LGBTQ person was Abraham Lincoln, but was he a man who loved another man? I feel confident, yes, that's what I believe. And I think that might explain a lot about, Mary Todd. She was kind of very concerned with her place in society and how they would be perceived, and was, kind of a social climber. And, I think that it answers a lot of questions about like things that otherwise don't really make sense about their relationship sort of click into place. And maybe it explains her depression. Maybe it explains his depression. I think, it definitely explains his depression. He had like almost like an emotional breaking point that he reached and it was, if you look at it, historians are always like, they have even a term for the date, like, like this horrible moment in Abraham Lincoln's life, and where he broke off his engagement with Mary Todd prior to marrying her. There was a period of time where they had been engaged, and he went into this, sunk into this terrible depression. And they're like, yeah, we don't have any, we can't really explain it. There's no real reason for it. But if you look at the timing of it, it was exactly when Joshua left him and moved back to Kentucky to marry Fanny. It was the exact time. So like when the historians are like, yeah, we don't know why, I don't know why he did it. It's like, well, really? Really, you don't know? Or you're just not telling people? Because there's a pretty clear path time-wise. Now, I don't know for sure, but to me, it seems pretty obvious that those things are connected.
Well, we see this even today, like even as even up to this day. But we if we look back just a few decades back in Hollywood with people like Cary Grant and Rock Hudson, Jim Neighbors, even people where it was completely obvious, like Liberace. I mean, they would never mention, or Johnny Mathis, or any actors or singers. They could never, Barry Manilow. I mean, the list just goes on. And not until the 70s when Elton John actually came out and said it's not, it's okay whether you love a woman or a man. There's nothing wrong with either one. And then you had, of course, Freddie Mercury, who came out as well. And so that's when things started to change a little bit. But it was still, decades later, and we still have it going on where they tell you, your your agents will tell you, don't do this. It's a death sentence for your career if you do this.
I mean, and you look, I mean, like what's on Netflix, this week is, this, coming out Colton about this guy who was an NFL football player and was the Bachelor, on a show trying to, whittle down 30 women, dating them to find who is he going to marry. And he's gay, and he was hiding the whole time. And, and then there was another story in the news about some actor who is on one of the really popular shows, and he just came out as gay, and he's like 38 years old, and he's like, yeah, I've been with my boyfriend for 18 years. And I'm thinking, I'm really excited that these people are coming out, but it also fills me with a little bit of sadness that we still haven't made things safe enough for people to come out and be more authentic earlier. So this book is kind of trying to make the world
Right.
a safer place so people can be authentic now. Like, what, it sucks to be closeted. I did it for 14 years. Like, I want to make, especially for kids, especially for young kids today, but for everybody reading it, really, like, let's repopulate history properly with all these amazing stories that are queer, inclusive. And then, if you know that you have a place in history, I think that you have a better sense that you deserve a place at the table today. And if you know that you deserve a place at the table today, I think that you can imagine a future without limits. And that's really important. Like, we have to populate our imaginations as well as we need to
Right.
repopulate history.
Well, I think, you know, Tom Daly said this in an interview. He's a diver, an Olympic diver for Great Britain, um, and he talked about how it can be challenging for people who are gay that have to go to countries where it's illegal to be gay. And he goes, there's no assurance of my safety. There's no assurance for the safety of the spectators who come to that country to watch the Olympics. And he said, and I don't think as long as, you know, being gay is illegal, that they should be able to host the games. And I agree with him, because if it's not safe for everybody, then why would you be allowed to host the games? And, you know, that's a privilege, and it should
I
only be
agree
a privilege that's
completely.
given to countries that you know are exclusive and are inclusive of everyone. And so, um, so you know, he made a very good point. And we see this still today, even in sports where we go, you know, like a lot of sports they say like are, oh, those are gay sports. Like, for instance, figure skating. There are men figure skaters who are Olympic champions, and I'm not gonna out anyone, but I know for a fact that they're gay, but they can't, you know, even they don't come out. It's like, it's one of those things where it's like unspoken, you know. I think
Mm.
everyone knows, but no one there says it, because if you do, then the judges will start judging you more harshly if you come out. And then that's happened in the past. And so, you know, it's a shame that we still have to go through this at this level, that, you know, even this younger generation still has to go through it. And
It goes back, I think, to something Harvey Milk said, where, you know, the idea that if everybody came out, then that would destroy the closet forever, right? Like, because if everybody was out, and then it wouldn't be possible for people to hold on to these prejudices, and to, because everybody would know a whole bunch of people that were out. And, you know, if 10% of the competing athletes in a given sport were gay, it would stop being such a big deal.
it
But
would be.
that's why it's such a big deal with, like, you know, Colton. Sorry, we just watched this coming at Colton, but Colton um, it was gay the same or the same season when they were picking the people for the teams. I forget the
Michael,
draft,
right?
as Michael Sam,
Yeah,
and Michael Sam was out and gay and kissed his boyfriend, and then was completely sidelined, and was drafted but never really played, and was really sidelined in the sport. And Colton was closeted and went on to have a career, and then a reality TV show, and like all this stuff. It's very poignant. Also, I think it's worth noting that Michael Sam is Black, and, you know,
right.
Colton is this straight appearing white guy that's very handsome. And the people, you know, and Michael Sam's really handsome too, but it's like,
Yes.
it's sort of like, how does our world work? Like, which of these two guys became the Bachelor?
Well,
Like, I want to see the Bachelor season with Michael Sam and 30 guys.
there you go. The thing is that I don't think there would have been any difference as far as results go if Colton had come out just like Michael Sam. If he had joined Michael Sam, I think they would have both been sidelined, and neither one of them would have had a career. I will tell you
Yeah.
this: I watched that Netflix special with Colton Underwood, and when he told his story, he is the first person I related to. His story was my story, and I couldn't believe all these years later he's experiencing the same thing I experienced back decades ago. And I realized why it was: religion and the locker room. If you are raised in a religious family, or if you play sports, there's this negative perception of being gay. That it's like the whole thing of playing football. You can pat people on the ass when you're playing football when they make a good play, because there's no gay people here, so it's not gay. That's the mentality of it. And it's until that changes in the locker room, until the coaches. I felt really bad for Colton when he went back to his high school to tell his coach, hey, you shouldn't have allowed this to be, this environment to be fostered, where there was, this negativity and homophobia going on. And all the coach could say, well, it's a tough world. And I was like,
It's
I want to
such a
smack you
pathetic answer.
right.
That was a terrible moment. I was so frustrated, but it really, like, it's interesting, the idea of sort of like the sort of like hyper, some people would say toxic masculinity that is associated with some of these sports, and how hand in hand with that comes this sort of homophobia and this sort of like trash talking gay people, because um, the intimacy that people feel on a sports team, I've heard it said that it's a lot like, it's like that I, as a gay man, wouldn't understand the sort of camaraderie of a team and how important that connection is. And because of these sort of stereotypes of like what feeling love for another man, and that how that has to be sexualized in our culture, I think it sort of boomerangs back into this sort of like hyper masculine, super, trash talking queer people thing, because that makes it safe to be affectionate, to put your arm around another guy, or to hug him. And like it is interesting, one of the chapters in the book about the lieutenant nun, it was in the 1600s, and there was this person who was, born into with a woman's body, and was raised in a convent, right? Like raised to be a nun. And when they were 16, escaped, and cut their hair, and found men's clothes, and made their way to Central and South America as a guy and as a soldier, and kind of took on all these really horrible Spanish male masculine things, like murdered people, and was just like a gambler, and really dismissive of women, and really terrible to women, and was in multiple love affairs, and like all this crazy stuff, because they didn't want to so much subvert the gender binary. They just wanted to get into the gender that had more power and more agency. And that was really a challenging moment too, because it's like, this was this kind of terrible person from history. And like, but then I thought, well, to only have wonderful people in history is also kind of unrealistic, right? Like, there are going to be some really lousy people in history who were queer, just like
Oh
there were
yeah.
lousy people in history who were straight. And that became sort of important too, to include in the book, because it's like, I don't want to say that everyone great in history was queer, or everyone terrible in history was queer, but it's just like, it's part of that complexity, right? Like,
Right.
we can be complex. But I do think there's something about the connection between sports and masculinity that people confuse. Like, I did it too. This idea that to be a guy means that you're like, you have a deep voice, and you don't cry. Like, there are all these sort of like stereotypes we had about what it means to be masculine. And in a lot of ways, we are taught that being gay means you are the opposite of masculine. If you look at the language we use in our culture to put down women, it is almost identical to the language we use to put down gay men.
Exactly.
It's
Because it's perceived as weak. And I was going to say, as an athlete and someone who's played almost every sport there is, I mean, I've been in those locker rooms. I know I know why they do what they do. And back in the day, when I was younger, of course, I wasn't out of the closet. I didn't come out of the closet until I was 40 in 2000. I had my first MMA fight when I was 50 in the cage, and beat the tar out of this guy. And and so when people would say it then, after I came out of the closet, they would say, I'd hear a comment like, "Oh, you're what are you, little pansy or something?" And I would look at them and go, "Would you like your ass beat by a pansy?" And they'd look at me like, "What do you mean?" I go, "I know what you're referring to. And if you're trying to say that gay people are weak, then let's get in the cage and let's find out." And because they had no clue I was gay, because it's not that I was hiding it. It's just that I don't go up and go, "Hey, I'm Kurt Powers, I'm gay." So I don't, you don't introduce yourself
nice to meet you, Kurt.
so, unless of course you're a hot twink, then I might do that. But I'm joking.
But I'll tell you, I mean, Kurt, it's really interesting because we both are sort of, I mean, you're more of an athlete, but like, I'm a writer. But I definitely don't necessarily, and also being a parent, you know, and being a stay-at-home dad, I get, um, I guess I pass as a straight guy, and I did a lot. So I actually have this sort of thing that I do because I hated being in the closet. It made me crazy. So pretty much within 30 seconds of meeting someone, I work into the conversation that I have a husband, because I just don't want to waste my time. And if someone's going to be a jerk about it, I would like to know right off the bat, so I don't have to waste any time talking to them. And it is this weird, litmus test that I've developed,
Right.
because I don't always wear like shirt with rainbow collar on it,
Right.
and and especially being a guy in this kind of a suburb neighborhood of Los Angeles with a baby, a newborn baby. We just moved to the neighborhood 10 days before she was born. And, I would get like, oh, mom's day off, or, like, oh, what a good father you are to give the mom a break. And I'm like, no, no, my husband's at the office, right? Like I just, it was like a way of kind of defending myself, and not being closeted. And it makes me think of like, people who are bi, who are in relationships that are perceived as straight, and how they feel like they're made invisible in the queer community. And I mean, another conversation, but
Right.
it's a
No,
similar thing.
and I understand why you do that. And I'll tell you why I don't. I'm sure you heard, just like I did, people say to you, no way, you're gay. And I go, and so I'll tell you a real short story. My best straight friend at the time, he didn't know I was gay. We worked out together at the gym, and we'd only known each other for a few months, and because I had just moved to Orlando, and as I would go out to the clubs at whatever night, and so I would notice people, and people would notice me. Well, I started noticing some of those people worked out the same gym that I worked out at, and of course my friend worked out with me as well, and I knew they're going to automatically think, oh, he's gay, that must be his gay boyfriend or whatever. And I didn't feel that was right to him. I felt like he should have a right to know, so that if he no longer wanted to work out with me because of that, all right, I understand. So I you know the cliche is, we went to Olive Garden for dinner one night, and because I told him, I said, look, there's something I want to tell you. And so he's like, so we're sitting down, he goes, okay, what is the big news that the big news you want to tell me? And I go, I just wanted to tell you, that you and I work out at the gym and stuff, and I know people there, and I said, and they're going to think possibly things about you because of me. And I said, and the fact is that I'm gay. And he looked at me and he goes, get the fuck out of here. And I go, what? I go, no, I'm gay. And he goes, whatever. And I go, I'm telling you, I'm gay. And he looks at me like to see if I'm joking, and he realizes I'm not. And he goes, well, I'm straight, don't you? And I said, shut up. And so I go, the only reason I told you is because there's people in the gym that I recognize from the clubs and stuff, and they may think that about you. And he goes, I don't care. He goes, and the thing was, is he got to know me, and he didn't, so he didn't have any of these ideas of what he thought I was going to be, because he didn't know. And so I found that with not telling people, they have a chance to get to know me. And all of a sudden, all those stereotypes that they think about gay people go right out the window, because and not that there's anything wrong with the stereotypes. It's just, I don't portray any of those. And so it gives people the opportunity to know a gay person, and not judge them, before they get to know them. But again, I completely understand, because a lot of times you want to know, is this guy a jerk? And I want to find out right now before we could become friends.
Well, and I think it's good. It's my husband's an actor in sort of the improv world. There's yes and. So I think it's good. I think it's good that you do your strategy, and it's good that I do my strategy. And it's like there's enough room in our world for both approaches, for many more approaches, I'm sure as well. Um, I think that it's a lot about safety. It's a lot about like,
Right.
do you feel safe? And and that's math that we're as queer people, I think we do all the time. It's not that I do as a queer person all the time. Like, am I safe? Can I hold my husband's hand, as we're walking down this street?
And
Or
yeah, and when I first came out and started dating my first boyfriend, of course, he introduced me to his friends, and his friends became my friends, and we went out to eat. We went out to eat at a Thai place, and after we got done eating, we were all stuffed, and there had to be probably at least 8 to 10 of us, and someone says, "Oh, do y'all want to go to Pizza Hut at 9 o'clock?" And that's like 2 hours away. And I go, "Pizza Hut? We just ate. I'm stuffed. What do you mean Pizza Hut?" And my boyfriend laughed and he goes, "They mean Parliament House." Now, Parliament House is world famous. It's no longer, unfortunately, closed, but it was a famous nightclub here in Orlando where people would come from around the world to go to Parliament House. And I said, "Well, then why doesn't he just say Parliament House?" And it's because they were afraid of people hearing them, and because of my size and because of who I am, I don't worry about anyone. I don't care what they say or what they think. If you have a problem, then let's deal with it. But they're not my size, and so I understood, that they had to be more cautious and careful about what they said, and it was unfortunate that they felt that need, and so I've always wanted to be there to protect people and go, "Listen, you can be in whoever you want to be, and if anyone gives you any crap, just let me know. We'll take care of it." So,
that's interesting. Like, they were using code, and that was one
right,
of the things in the intro chapter. I have this. Even in writing their journals, people have had to use secret codes so they could actually write what they wanted to write without anybody
right,
possibly stumbling upon it and reading it. Um, there was this. There's this, and in fact, it was interesting because they made like a mini series on one of the streaming channels on it. But Anne Lister, in 1821, was writing in her diary. I'm going to bring up more stuff. So here's a code, right? So she writes it as like, it's like this random collection of like numbers and letters and Greek letters and punctuation points. And so it's all in regular like English. And then she'll shift to this, what she called her crypt hand, and writes a line like this. Burnt all Caroline Greenwood's foolish notes and Mr. Montague's farewell verses, that no trace of any man's admiration may remain. It is not meet for me. I love and only love the fairer sex. That's what they used to call women back then.
right.
And thus, beloved by them in turn, my heart revolts from any other love than theirs. And it took like 100 years for that to get, like, for someone to break the code and to
Right.
translate these diaries.
And you show that throughout history that people did things like use code to, and like I just pointed out, even into today's society, we still use code to in certain situations, because that's the thing I think that a lot of people don't understand, is that while we've made great strides here in the US, there's still big pockets of this country where you can't just be out and about and think everything's going to be safe. The major metropolises or metropolitan cities, there's still some danger there in certain parts, but it's why it's more accepted. But you go to places like Indiana or Kentucky or anywhere in the Midwest, other than maybe Chicago, it's like you still have these prejudices that are in this bigotry that flourishes there. And I feel for these kids who grew up in those areas, knowing that they have to do the same thing. They have to hide who they are. They have to, if they're going to express their love, they have to do it in code, or as secretly as they
Yeah,
possibly can.
yeah, I'll meet you at Pizza Hut.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So,
Wow, it's really that yeah, and it's still, I mean, I'm thinking of when Bayard Rustin, who was the guy that organized the March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave that amazing speech. Bayard was openly gay, and he was really sidelined in the civil rights movement,
right,
because they were using his being gay as a way to blackmail. And at one point, somebody threatened to say that he was in a gay relationship with Martin Luther King Jr., which he wasn't. But because he was openly gay, there was this sort of like way that enemies could kind of like get in and manipulate stuff. And so he really got pushed to the side. And even though he was the guy that taught the whole theory of nonviolence to Martin Luther King Jr. And so that was kind of amazing. And then when he was jailed a number of times for things like trying to break the segregation rules about, sitting in the front of the bus, being a Black person in America. And one of the many times that he was arrested, he was in a relationship with this guy, Davis, and they had to correspond as if Davis was a girl, and changing the pronouns and moving everything around just to keep themselves safe. So because they knew the mail was going to be opened and read. And even Gandhi, when he was in a relationship with Herman Kallenbach, because Kallenbach was German, he was put in a kind of prison in England, because at the time there was the war with England and Germany, and so they had to stop using their coded language, right? And their sort of secret, sort of pet names for each other, upper house and lower house. And suddenly they were like, my dear friend. Like it was like much more formal. And so it's fascinating to see how it's all about, can we stay safe? How can we stay safe? And yet still let these stories come out from history.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Bayard Rustin, because one of the things I want to talk about is that he had the vision that that this wasn't just about gay rights. This was, in order for us to have gay rights, we were going to have to push the civil rights. We had to push women's rights. This was about shaping an America that was fair and across the board. And I really liked his approach. And like you said, that he was the one who kind of helped Martin Luther King do this nonviolent protesting, which he actually, if I remember correctly, you said he got it from Gandhi. Was that correct?
Right. And then it was really interesting because there was this, one of the fun things, like where it starts to be more chocolate than medicine, is when you start to draw these amazing connections between different pieces of history.
Right.
So like women's history, like there was this amazing moment where I'm gonna try to find it, and it was in the idea that, so Gloria Steinem wrote in her autobiography, My Life on the Road, she talks about going to India in the 1970s because she wanted to learn like Gandhian tactics. And so she could put it into a pamphlet for women's movements everywhere. And when she got to India, she ended up meeting this woman named Kamladevi Chattopadhyaya. I may be mispronouncing that, and I apologize. But a woman leader who had worked with Gandhi in the fight for Indian independence, where Steinem learned that the tactics Gandhi used were actually learned from women in India who had protested the practice of, they used to burn widows on their husbands' funeral pyres. Like there was a whole like movement of sort of like, we don't want that to happen. And then also women in Britain fighting for voting rights. So all these tactics that Gandhi became famous for, these non-violent protest tactics, were actually tactics from the women's movement. And yet, because the sort of great man theory of history, like who gets the credit for it,
Right.
He wasn't white, but it was this guy. So I thought that was super fascinating too. This idea that like history is really more interesting and more complex than we give it credit for. And we think that like, one idea just sort of pops up and it's like this brilliant thing that this one guy came up with. Like, wait. This is, he took it and but you have to acknowledge that like it was women who taught him all this. So I thought that was fascinating.
It is fascinating. What I want to do is because I know if we do it the way I want to do it, we'll be here for 3 hours. So I want to do this, and I don't want to keep you for 3 hours. I want to talk about at least two people, because we already talked about a little bit about Bayard Rustin. We talked about Gandhi. We talked about Lincoln, and there's so many more people in the book. And people, I'll tell you about this after we get done with this discussion. But go buy the book. It's such a great book, and it's such an enjoyable read. I mean, I think you'll be pleasantly amazed with just how much you learn and how and how much fun it was. So let's talk about Sappho, because you mentioned her earlier. She was a poet. She was born on the island of Lesbos, and she and the thing that I love that you wrote about her is that she took the concept of making love the most powerful thing instead of glory of heroic deeds, and
Hmm.
up until her, like all the poets before her, it was all about heroic deeds, and she was the one that said love is the most important thing. And I
Absolutely. And I need to, absolutely, you said it so well, but I need to credit Dr. Christine Downing, who wrote about that in her book, um, because a lot of what I'm doing is not like I'm, uh, you know, digging up ancient journals, finding, in a
right.
cave somewhere. Like I'm just going to the library and reading books for adults that are like 600 pages and read a little bit like medicine and trying to distill it down.
You're taking
Um,
medicine and turning it into chocolate for us, and we appreciate
it's
that.
that's my alchemy, right? That's my
Exactly.
superpower. But yeah, like it is amazing. Sappho really had this poem and this belief that the most important thing in the world is love. And like you say, everybody before her was like, no, the most important thing, the most powerful thing in the world is armies and ships and soldiers and glory. And yeah, and she was like, no, it's the face of the woman. The thing that matters most to me isn't that. It's that I miss the face of the woman I love, Aunt Victoria, flashing radiant. And I'd rather have that than all the force of Lydian chariots in their full display of arms. Like that was an amazing breakthrough. And what's so crazy is that resonated so much with people that even though we don't really know today that Aunt Victoria was in love with these women, that's not really taught. But that idea that love is the most powerful thing in the universe cascaded down from those, more than 2,000 years ago to the point where, 800 years ago, when the Sleeping Beauty myth was sort of created as a story in France. What breaks the evil spell? What's the most powerful thing of all? It's the kiss of true love, right? And then it cycles down hundreds more years, and then we get all these Disney movies where it's like, what breaks the evil spell? It's the kiss of true love. And it all comes to us because Sappho was in love with this woman, Anna Victoria. But we've kind of, sanitized the history and taken the queer part of it out. And we're like, oh yeah, I heard Sappho was, a famous poet. Like, no, she was a famous poet and she was amazing, but it was because she loved another woman and she had this enormous breakthrough in terms of how we think about the world and how we think about what is meaningful in our lives. And I think that is something to remember.
Definitely. Now, I want to move on to Eleanor Roosevelt, because when I read about Eleanor Roosevelt and what you wrote in the book, I thought the letter that she wrote to her lover, Lorena Hickok, I just had so much sadness, because I was like, the love that she had and the loneliness that they felt because they couldn't be together. I was just like, this is such a tragic story,
Mm.
because Eleanor, I mean, Franklin, she married her distant cousin, Franklin. They were both, Eleanor Roosevelt was born Eleanor Roosevelt, and I'm only quoting this because I read it from your book. That's how I know it. So it wasn't like I knew it beforehand. And he had cheated on Eleanor and was having an affair with Eleanor's press
No,
secretary.
with his press secretary,
Oh, with his
Lucy.
press
Yeah.
secretary. Okay, with his press secretary, long before she had met Lorena, and so anyway, Lorena and her fell in love, and the letters are just heartbreaking. Like, the ones that you'd put in there, and I thought one of my favorite presidents of this country was John Adams, just because he was such an upright, honest man. Like, he liked to debate, to make sure that the answer that you had was the right answer. And the opposite of Jefferson, who was a politician and didn't like to debate because he didn't like losing. So, but Jefferson gets all this credit, and Adams doesn't get as nearly as much. But John Adams and Abigail Adams were known for this amazing love that they had for one another. And I thought, John and Abigail had nothing over Eleanor and Lorena. Nothing. I was like, when I read the letters, I was like, again, it was just so tragic that you had two people so in love, and yet it was this forbidden love that they could never fulfill. And even talking about later on, where they would joke about having that house that they could live in, knowing that that was never going to happen because Lorena, and again, I learned all this from you. Lorena wanted Eleanor for herself. And unfortunately for Lorena, Eleanor belonged to the world because Eleanor had bigger things that she had to do. And all the work that she did, the compassion that she had, and all the things that that she influenced Franklin with, as far as um, the different movements that took place at that time. It just, she had to be the person that she was. She couldn't just walk away from that, and
Yeah.
she understood that responsibility.
One of the most amazing things for me in doing all the research was like, I pretty much, until I was about 80% through the research for the book, I kind of was like, I'm writing this fun book, that's sort of like, chocolate about history. And I kept thinking that it was this cool footnote about history. And, like, oh yeah, this person was a guy like Gandhi, nice footnote. He was also a guy who loved another guy, but whoa, look at the cool things he did. And, Eleanor Roosevelt, nice footnote. She was in love with this other woman, Lorena, but like, let's really look at the amazing things that Eleanor Roosevelt did. But it was actually in researching Gandhi and reading the letters between Eleanor and Lorena that I kind of had this epiphany. And I was like, wait, maybe it's not a footnote. Maybe Eleanor Roosevelt was able to do the incredible things she did, not despite or as an aside that she was a woman that loved another woman, but because she was a woman that loved another woman. I mean, like, to think about Eleanor being the person that after the death of her husband, becomes, becomes an ambassador. I don't think she was an ambassador, but she becomes this figure at the United Nations, leading the movement to create a universal declaration of human rights. Like, that's kind of astonishing. And the idea that she was motivated in part because she understood what being othered meant, right? Being someone that couldn't be public and open about the love that she felt, it suddenly made history sort of open up. And I'm changing metaphors, like a flower, right? Like, suddenly it's like this incredible insight into, like, well, maybe Gandhi was able to like make the impact he had, not despite the fact that he was in love with this other guy, but because he was a man that loved another man in a time where that was not seen as cool. Maybe that gave him more compassion and more understanding and more motivation to upend, the sort of structure of power of Britain, and fight for independence. Like, it's just so cool. You start to look at these different things. Abraham Lincoln in love with Joshua Fry Speed. Did that change how Abraham approached thinking about the Civil War and about, the plight of African Americans, who are, especially those who were enslaved? Like, wow, it just starts to, you see it all so differently. It's that world flipped up, maps flipped upside down. And so for me, like, that was really exciting when I was like, wait, maybe it's not just this cool footnote. Maybe it's actually, this is part of why they were amazing in history.
Yeah, I think you made that point, because when you made that, I was like, you're absolutely right. I believe that that's a big part of why they did the things they did when they were, even though they weren't out, they were part of a marginalized group, and they had compassion for these other marginalized groups because they understood what it meant to be part of that kind of group. And I think it's because of that they had the compassion for others that maybe, straight white males wouldn't have, because they didn't have to, they don't have to think that way. It's funny that I have a lot of straight white friends, but it's funny how over the years when I first came out, how, when I would let people know, there would be people that I'd go out to, to the bar with and watch sports or whatever, and they would say things that were insensitive. They didn't realize they were being sensitive. They didn't realize that, they didn't realize like things like before we could get married, that, that we could, that if we loved somebody and they were in the hospital, if their family didn't want us in there, we couldn't go, we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And they didn't understand because it's not something they had to deal with. And I'm glad to see that, more and more people are coming to understand and as to why these things were important for us, and understanding the things that we had to go through just because they didn't. And it's just human nature. We never think about, how the world affects other people. We only think about how it affects ourselves. And so, I wasn't mad at them, but it was kind of an eye-opening thing to see, oh, they're not aware of anything except what involves them. And I'm sure that's the way it was, during, slavery and stuff. White guys like, I don't, what's the big deal? Sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I heard a good metaphor once, and they were saying that, like, for people that are right-handed, it's very hard to recognize how the world is set up for right-handed people.
Yeah,
Like, someone hands you a pair of scissors, you can use them. But if you're left-handed, someone hands you a pair of scissors, and you're like, damn, this doesn't work at all. Like,
and you don't, as a right-handed person, you don't think about that. You just go,
why would it occur to you,
right,
right? Like,
exactly, yeah.
but it's good for us to know that, hey, there are left-handed people, and maybe we should have scissors that work for everybody.
Exactly. One of the other things I just wanted to add is that, beyond just famous people, there were people behind the scenes. I did a show with Anthony P. Hillo, who has a podcast, and he was talking about, he talked about different people, in history that were gay that no one knew about, and he spoke a lot about this one gentleman who was the aide to Lyndon B. Johnson. He was his trusted aide. Johnson went to him about everything. And this gentleman, and then please forgive me, I don't remember his name right off the bat, but he was gay, and it didn't come out till years and years later. And Lady Bird Johnson, to her credit, and even Lyndon, supported him and was behind him. But Lyndon had to let him go when it was discovered, because at that time you couldn't hold a federal job if you were gay. And
Right.
and yet here's a man who helped shape history by being, the voice for Lyndon B. Johnson, Lyndon came to him for advice and stuff, where he actually, did things because of what this man told him. So there's even people like that who were behind the scenes that weren't famous and yet still had a major effect on our history and the things that happened.
Yeah, I mean, there was a baron that was brought over from Europe to train the troops at Valley Forge, right? And like, he was gay, and everybody
Oh,
knew it at the
really?
time. Yeah, yeah, and von Steuben, I think, and yeah, somebody else that didn't make it in the book, but it's just, the idea is that, like, now that the facade is down, like, there's so many more things to discover.
Yeah, I always, one of the things that when they were talking about gay people being allowed in the military, and even trans people, and I was like, do you people know that the greatest army ever put together were 300 gay men? They were such a great army that Philip, Alexander the Great's father, King Philip, erected a statue in their honor, because he said they were such honorable men, that they were the most honorable people he had ever, encountered, and erected a statue. Who does that? Who erects a statue to their enemy? And yet he did,
Yeah,
because of how,
after killing them all,
after
by the way.
exactly.
But yeah, it's kind of amazing. It's called the Line of Charanaya, and it is a huge, like, it's huge. It's like, I don't know, like 5-story tall building,
It's
um,
that tall?
and it's pretty damn tall. I've seen photos and, like, the like tourist photos, and it's this enormous. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe it's 2 stories, but
No,
it's
even that,
really, really
I had
big.
no idea it was that big. Like, I knew it was big, but I didn't know it was like, that's huge.
and they and they've discovered that some of the people, some of the soldiers from the Sacred Band of Thebes that were buried in as couples. They were buried in pairs. So, like, even in death, they tried to honor that love. And yeah, I mean, Plato had this line of like, if only we could fashion an army out of lovers and their loves, then they'd be invincible. Because who would be willing to like abandon their post or like flee when the person they love most is going to see
Right.
them do it? They're going to fight. They say, I think Plato's line is, the veriest coward would become a hero, right? Because they would be seen fight, they would be fighting side by side with the one they love best in the whole world. And indeed, they were the kick-ass guys
They
of that millennia.
And
And
they had never lost a battle until that last one. But it needs to be noted that Alexander and his father had an army of, like, I want to say it was estimated somewhere between 12 to 15,000. The Band of Thieves were with other groups that I think they were somewhere around 7 to 8,000. All of them ran except them. They were the only ones who refused to retreat and run and fought to the end. That tells you, like, what just what you said, that the coward will become the hero because you won't leave the person that you love. And
yeah, and still we grow up in a world where it's like being gay means that you're effeminate, you're a sissy, you're not strong.
right.
All these sort of like weird things that we've created in this binary system, where it's like, oh, there's only one way to be a guy and there's only one way to be a girl. And the world is so much more interesting than that.
Exactly. And it's unfortunate because, again, stereotypes play a big role in that. It's like, if you were gay, you were a poet, or you were an actor, or you were doing something that didn't require a lot of physicalness to it. And so, it over the time, it's like, oh, if you're gay, you're a fairy, a pansy, a weak, and that's how, people who were strong viewed it, or, thought they were strong. And yet, if you were gay, like I was, you had to hide that because you knew you weren't weak. But if you said you were gay, they were. And the funny thing is I actually had that happen when I came out. My one of my brothers actually said something about that, referred to him like kicking my butt. And I was like, and I told my sister, I said, listen, I go, he couldn't do it in a million years. And he thinks all of a sudden now, because I'm gay, that somehow I'm a little fairy now. Like, that's exactly what popped in his head. And I go, and it's not just him. It's people like that as a whole. If you come out, like even with Colton or Michael Sam, he before he came out, they praised him and praised his abilities on the football field. As soon as he came out, there was this talk about, oh, not be able to do this, not be able to do that. And almost, like coming out and saying it without saying that, oh, he's weak. He's not big enough. He's not strong enough. It was all nonsense.
Yeah, it's just prejudice.
Yes. So, Lee, I thoroughly enjoyed this.
It was a lot of fun. We covered a lot.
We did, and I'm really glad. Again, I'm glad that I had a chance to read your book. I'm looking forward to reading your next book that you put out. And again, folks, it's called No Way They Were Gay. Where can they find this, Lee? Where can people pick this up?
If you ask me, I'm going to say your local independent bookstore, but you can get it anywhere books are sold online. And there's a Kindle edition there's an ebook version as well. I don't think the ebook version is as fun because it is more like, the classic way that a footnote works. But yeah, I think most important is just the idea that you can read it in whatever order you want, really. I mean, once you read the 2 introductory chapters, then you're off and running. And and it's the first of a series. The idea that it's going to ultimately be 3 books. I'm working on the second now, and it's called The Gender Binary is a Big Lie. So that will come out in 2023, I think.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, we're definitely going to we'll have a discussion about that. So I'm looking.
Sounds great.
I do want to say, is there anywhere people could reach you? Do you have any social media or website or anything that they can?
Yeah, they can find me on leewin.org. It's just on a website, and you can find all all my different social media stuff there as well.
Okay, excellent. Well, Lee, thank you again for being on the show. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to having you on the show again. And keep up the great work. So,
Thanks very much, Kurt. I really appreciate the opportunity.
okay, folks. Well, listen, I know you enjoy. I'm going to say I know you enjoyed this as much as I did. So, thanks for joining us. And until next time, take care, be safe, and I would say wear your mask. But right now it's up to you. Wear your mask if you want, but just be safe. Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye bye.